Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. Very exciting times in Pakistan with a full-blown political crisis ongoing. We thought this is as good a time as any to try and talk about something that maybe isn't as well covered in terms of our national discourse as we'd like. The government of Pakistan recently produced a national gender policy framework, and like so many things related to people's rights, this framework was received warmly, obviously, by a number of activists and people invested in the in gender mainstreaming, but it didn't really make a huge dent in the national discourse. And going through the national gender policy framework has prompted a lot of thinking and many questions, a lot of very positive feedback, but a lot of critical feedback too. We thought it would be useful to engage the experts, as we always try to do here at the Tabadlab, and to understand a little bit more about the national gender policy framework. And in that regard, we've requested a fantastic panel of experts to come and talk to us. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Farzana Bari, Dr. Aisha Razak, Dr. Nasima Zainul Abidin, Dr. Ammar Malik, and I believe at some point we'll also be joined, inshallah, by Dr. Moiz Avan. None of these individuals need an introduction to me, given their sort of long and distinguished careers and contributions. So and we'll have intros in the link, and they're available on the poster as well. I really want to, instead of wasting time and instead of me taking up their time, I just want to jump right into it. Dr. Bari, this national gender policy framework, I'm going to subdue my own temptation to offer my judgment. And I'll ask you, first of all, where this came from. How did this government or any government, I mean, is this a product of this government, or is it a bureaucratic exercise? Was this driven by donors, or were civil society activists and gender rights activists involved in the run-up and the synthesis of the policy? Were you consulted on the policy? Where did it come from is really the first question that I want to understand myself and hopefully our viewers as well.
Thank you, Musharraf. Thank you for having me in this program. So I think certainly I think this framework came out of a very consultative process, and I remember that Ministry of Planning and Development, they have been going to even provinces for the consultation processes. They have also involved civil society. So obviously it's a product of basically. I would say it's also a continuation of the process which has been there. So I think if you look at a lot of like kind of priority areas, and look at kind of a policy action, those are not that new. In fact, these are the things which we have been talked about by the women's movement since long. People have been demanding this kind of institutional reforms. They're asking for the adoption of gender mainstreaming policies. So in terms of, I think the priority areas which has been identified in this framework are all very has been actually the priority areas which are there, in terms of, the women's organization, women's movement have been flagging issues, in these areas. So in that way, I feel it's really comprehensive plan, although obviously no document is like 100% like you could say perfect. Certainly there are a lot of still, despite all that consultative process, because it's a government document, I think still we feel there are some issues, very important issues, which got excluded and needs to be flagged. Particularly, for example, if I can very briefly talk about, like, when I look at. In fact, I have sent my some of these issues with regard to this policy. I already sent that to. Uh, Dr. Shabnam, who is the social sector, she was the driving force behind this policy, and I already shared those comments with her. So, for example, I feel still like in terms of like overall conceptual framework when we talk about economic empowerment or women's employment, I feel that certainly there are very important areas which still the government is reluctant to talk about in terms of like, for example, the informal sector. Like there is no discussion in this document or no action, policy action in terms of how to basically take care of the women workers who are mostly in the informal sector of the economy. As you know, the informal sector of economy in Pakistan is 3 times bigger than the formal economy, and the 70% of the labor force in informal sector economy actually consists of women. So there is no, like in terms of, I feel this very important area that we should start thinking how to formalize the informal sector of Pakistan, and that will be hugely benefit the women workers, because they are concentrated in that. Similarly, I think there is a lot of talk about like women issues in the paid work, paid employment, but I think it's a high time, because feminists have been talking about the care economy and the shift which is needed from the paid economy also to look into the care economy, because women are contributing massively through care economy, and I think that's very important to also not only recognize this in the as a part of the GDP prosper, that is create the kind of contribution in the GDP, but also that how then women are actually multitasking and what kind of support is required there. So similarly, I think. There are some other issues, for example, when we talk about governance, and I think there are some of those areas which are identified very well, I would say, appropriately identified. However, I feel that um, if we are not looking at this whole patriarchal kind of nature of the institution itself, because unfortunately, if you look at the state, so if we are not able to analyze the kind of patriarchal, sort of what I'm saying, I'm not saying the state is kind of a monolith, but I think dominantly there are this kind of patriarchal and misogynist kind of thinking which does exist, in the
Sure,
institution.
and we've seen, Dr. Saiba, we've seen examples of those kinds of narratives jumping up out of nowhere from very high offices in the country, and I think it sets us back,
Precisely.
particularly in terms of mobilizing the energy that we need for a robustly gender positive sort of national policy framework.
Precisely, because of course the institutions are not gender neutral. So I think we need to also examine that, that how do we, if we want to institutionalize like this gender equality agenda or gender mainstreaming as a strategy within these institutions, which are inherently, are not like pro kind of, automatically going to, start planning and programming, in favor of women, then I think there's a lot more I think deeper understanding and action planning is required there. Similarly, Musharraf, in terms of electoral reforms, and I mean they talk about political voice, and I think the thing is that they're only looking in terms of representation, and I feel the voice women agency women voice is not only representation, in terms of numbers, so what are the areas, whereby women can play a more substantive role, in terms of, their voice. And also women agencies, not only in terms of, that they are participating as a voter, but when in a political process, especially in the political context of Pakistan, where that the whole mainstream political scenario, particularly political parties, are so male dominated, and it's not that the women are not there, I think women are there as voters, as candidates, as activists in political parties, but of course they are having a huge issues within all political parties. I think that goes, without saying whether it's a right, left, or centrist parties. They're all treating women in a manner, but more of like, not as a I mean, okay, they emerge as a constituency, and I think there's a step forward that they do recognize them as a constituency, but they're not still willing to give them a space to come as leaders, to come as decision maker, to come give them tickets on their strong. So I think electoral reforms is also missed out in this framework, which I think is kind of very much is very important. So what I'm saying basically is, similarly in health, I think GBV as a health issue has not been factored in some of these areas, which I think is important. And when they talked about in this framework about safety and security, and it's not about gender-based violence. Of course, I think there are a couple of good policy actions there, but I think what is very important to look into the criminal justice system, and what are we going to do with this criminal justice system, which is failing women. Wherever there is a violation of women's rights, what we see, there is a culture of impunity. You see there is a pattern, that exists, that no matter what happened, how severe that incident is and how high profile that incident is, what we end up seeing that there is hardly any, kind of punishment, or there's no justice. So
accountability.
justice,
Yeah.
so I think there are quite. So what I'm saying, okay, there are some areas which we would, as a feminist, as an activist, I would like to still flag. But I think the more important issue is, okay, whatever is in this framework, which is good enough, and as I said, it's nothing new. There are a lot of these policy actions which women have been talking, for the last many years, and especially since particularly after the Beijing 1995 onward, because we signed Beijing Platform of Action, then the SDGs, then all. So Pakistan is signatory to all those conventions and these commitments. So I think for me the most important question is that how the government of Pakistan, and especially because this framework came out of the federal government, the Ministry of Planning and Development, that how do we going to go operationalize this plan, and particularly, in the context of, 18th Amendment devolution, that how do we, make sure. So what are the steps which needs to be taken in order to operationalize this framework? I'm not talking about the kind of approach to gender mainstreaming, but I think I like to talk briefly about what, in my view, should be the roadmap in terms of operationalization of these policy frameworks.
So Dr. Eba, I want you to speak about that as well, but I also want to bring everybody else into the conversation. I'll come back to you on that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about implementation. But before we do that, maybe just bring Dr. Aisha Razak into the conversation. Dr. Razak, there's a substantial, I think, body of work around the engagement of gender and gender policy with what Dr. Bari already alluded to in terms of employment and economic opportunity, and the viability of how economic activity by women, how it's treated in terms of national statistics, but also in terms of what kinds of skills engagement, for example, there is available to Pakistani women versus what isn't available to them. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that aspect of the policy. I know you've gone through the National Gender Policy Framework. Did you find it adequately addressing some of the economic engagement and empowerment issues that I think, quite rightly, Dr. Bari says need to be looked at more carefully? You'll have to mute. You'll have to unmute. All right. While you figure out the mute or unmute button, Ahmad, maybe I can ask you to jump in. And Dr. Nasima, I'll come to you just as we get done with Ahmad, and then we'll go back to Aisha at the end. We're going to punish her for having a bad mute button. Ahmad, this issue, I alluded to it just a moment ago, the issue of data. And how
I'm sorry, Musharraf, I'm back, if I may. And I'm sorry, Amar, but I'm cutting in because I think what I want to say, builds really well on what Dr. Bari just said. Musharraf, sabse pehle, I'm going to actually take a step back because I think, and I'll come to your question if I have enough time. Otherwise, I'll let Nasima speak about that, because I think education के अंदर वो she seems to have done a lot of work. लेकिन उससे भी पहले मुशर्रफ, I think we need to step back a little और थोड़ा सा ये देखना चाहिए कि ये I want to agree with Dr. Bari on a few things. जैसे कि उन्होंने कहा कि ये consultative process था, या it's, you know, to begin with it's a good start. There's obviously need to build on this, लेकिन ये कोई नई चीज नहीं है. मैं कोई इत्तेफाक से सुबह थोड़ी सी रिसर्च कर रही थी for this session and I saw कि 20 years ago ADP का एक मुझे डॉक्यूमेंट नजर आया. मोर और लेस सिमिलर बातें उसमें हुई हैं. इसी तरह जैसे डॉक्टर बारी ने कहा कि ऐसा नहीं है कि इंटरनेशनली ही हमने जब से साइन किए हैं कन्वेंशंस, वो बीजिंग का इन्होंने 95 का जिक्र किया है, ऑल ऑफ दैट. आई मीन इंडिजिनसली वैसे हमारे पास औरतों की इक्वालिटी या जेंडर इक्वालिटी के हवाले से इंडिजिनस बड़ा सारा काम होता रहा है और बड़ी खवातीन इसके अंदर सरगर्म रही हैं, आदमी सरगर्म रहे हैं, ट्रांसजेंडर कम्युनिटी सरगर्म रही है. तो मेरे ख्याल में मेरे लिए सबसे पहली एविडेंस इस बात का कि ये नेशनल पॉलिसी है या ये डोनर ड्रिवन और यूएन ड्रिवन पॉलिसी है, वो तो खैर आपको डॉक्यूमेंट देखकर ही समझ आ जाता है कि एड्रेस अगर पहले यूएन के जो रेजिडेंट जो भी उनका वो डेजिग्नेशन है, वो उनका मैसेज है, मतलब इट्स वेरी वेरी क्लियर दैट इट्स अ कंसल्टेंट मेड डॉक्यूमेंट. वो तो आपको डॉक्यूमेंट देख के पता चल जाता है, कोई नई बात इसमें नहीं है. मैं अग्री कर लेती हूँ कि ये इट्स अ गुड स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट, लेकिन स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट तो हम कह रहे हैं कि 20-25 साल पहले हो चुका है. सो व्हाट इज इट दैट दिस डॉक्यूमेंट इज एडिंग इन द डिबेट? पहली बात ये. दूसरा अफसोस जो मुझे देखकर इस डॉक्यूमेंट को सबसे पहले हुआ था, वो ये हुआ था, आई एम नॉट अ जेंडर एक्सपर्ट पर से, लेकिन इतना मुझे भी जेंडर के बारे में पता है, या ये कि बिकॉज आई वर्क इन एजुकेशन, ऑब्वियसली वी नो वहां पर इनइक्वालिटीज हैं ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ जेंडर. बट ये इतना वो सिंपलिस्टिक किस्म की चीज रह गई है कि औरतें या वर्सेस मर्द या नहीं. जेंडर देखिए, डोनर ने डिफाइन किया, आपने एसटीजी को कमिट किया हुआ है, आपने इंटरनेशनल कम्युनिटी को जवाब देना है, ऑल ऑफ दैट इज गुड. आप जरूर लिंक अप करें उसे अपने डॉक्यूमेंट पे, लेकिन ये आपकी प्लानिंग कमीशन, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ प्लानिंग का डॉक्यूमेंट है, ये पाकिस्तान का डॉक्यूमेंट है और ये जेंडर पॉलिसी फ्रेमवर्क है. जेंडर डिफाइन तो कर लें. तो जेंडर हम डिफाइन कैसे करते हैं? मुझे तो नहीं लगता है कि वो सिर्फ इस तरह होना चाहिए कि औरतों की इक्वालिटी वो बहुत पीछे रह गई हैं तो औरतों को आप थोड़ा सा वो इक्वल उसके ऊपर लेकर आए. मेरे ख्याल में हमें ये पता है कि ये इतना सिंपल इशू नहीं है. एजुकेशन की फॉर एग्जांपल मैं आपको एग्जांपल दे देती हूँ, और एग्जांपल से शुरू करती हूँ बिकॉज आई वाज टॉकिंग टू समबडी इन द मॉर्निंग एंड दे लुक्ड बैक एंड सेड कि तुम जरा ये थोड़ी एंटी वुमन बातें नहीं कर रही हो. तो मैं एकदम से मुझे हुआ, अच्छा मैं क्या ऐसी एंटी वुमन बात कर रही हूँ? तो वो एग्जाम्पल से शायद समझाना आसान होगा. और एग्जाम्पल मेरी ये है कि मैं मर्ज्ड एरियाज में मैंने पिछले 2-3 साल काफी काम किया, और मैं जाके मर्ज्ड एरियाज के अंदर जो हमारे एक्स फाटा के डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स हैं, तो वहाँ पे प्राइमरी स्कूल्स को मैं थोड़ा सा वो स्टडी करने गई कि यहाँ पे प्राइमरी स्कूल्स की क्या सिचुएशन है और एक्सेस फॉर बॉयज एंड गर्ल्स क्या सिचुएशन है. तो मुझे जाके पता चला कि लड़कियों के लिए एक्सेस बहुत बड़ा इशू है. स्कूल्स बहुत कम है, लड़कों के स्कूल्स भी बहुत कम है, लेकिन लड़कियों के उससे भी कम है. और लड़कियां आफ्टर प्राइमरी दे आर ड्रॉपिंग आउट मोर बिकॉज दे नीड एक्सेस. दे कांट कीप, वो जिस तरह प्राइमरी में दे आर अलाउड टू वॉक टू स्कूल, बट एज सून एज दे हिट देयर एडोलेसेंट वो ईयर्स, तो दे आर नॉट अलाउड टू वॉक, नॉट इवन इन ग्रुप्स. तो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन एक इशू है, एक्सेस एक इशू है, रियल इशू है. लेकिन 5वीं के बाद बहुत सारे लड़के भी ड्रॉप आउट हो रहे हैं. और वो लड़के क्यों ड्रॉप आउट हो रहे हैं? क्योंकि वो लड़के वहां पर, क्योंकि पावर्टी इतनी ज्यादा है जाहिर है मर्ज्ड एरियाज के अंदर, कि उन लड़कों को जब वो 10-12 साल के होते हैं तो उनको शहरों में अपने रिश्तेदारों के पास लेबर के लिए भेज दिया जाता है. सो कोई आपको जो इतने सारे बच्चे नजर आ रहे होते हैं यहाँ से, जो आपको लगता है केपी से आए हुए, उनमें से काफी सारे ऐसे जो वहां से कमाई के लिए आए हुए हैं. तो वो बूट पॉलिश कर रहे हैं या वो छली की रेडी लगा के खड़े हुए हैं. सो आई थिंक एक तो जेंडर को जरा थोड़ा सा देखें. और I'll just quickly finish my thought. ये प्लानिंग कमीशन का डॉक्यूमेंट है, विच मीन्स ब्रॉडली प्लानिंग कमीशन का काम क्या है कि जो आपके पब्लिक फंड्स हैं, आपका पीएसटीपी, आप उसको लिंक करें अपने मुल्क की ग्रोथ के साथ, प्रॉस्पेरिटी, इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट, ऑल ऑफ दोस गुड थिंग्स. उसके लिए जाहिर है आपको ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट की जरूरत है. अब ह्यूमंस को हमने कैटेगराइज कर दिया जेंडर्स के अंदर, उसके अंदर. और बाय द वे 2018 में हमारा बिल आ गया, फॉर गॉड सेक, इट्स नॉट अ बाइनरी एनीमोर, नॉट इवन इन पाकिस्तान. ट्रांस, आज इंटरनेशनल डे ऑफ विजिबिलिटी ऑफ ट्रांसजेंडर्स, today happens to be that day too. So it's very sad कि एक मुल्क के प्लानिंग कमीशन का विच सीम्स टू बी रन बाय प्रोग्रेसिव पीपल इज मैन बाय और वुमन बाय प्रोग्रेसिव पीपल, लेकिन उसके अंदर आपको जेंडर की डेफिनेशन इंक्लूसिव नजर नहीं आ रही है. इट्स अ सैड थिंग. तो मेरे ख्याल में जब तक वो नुआंस आप अपने फ्रेमवर्क के अंदर नहीं लेकर आएंगे, मुझे तो ये वो बस एसटीजी की खानापुरी वाला डॉक्यूमेंट लगता है. दूसरी एक जो जल्दी से मैं बात करना चाह रही हूँ कि वो ये है कि कंसल्टेशंस. मुझे यकीन है डॉक्टर बारी से भी उन्होंने वो बातचीत की होगी. शी इज अ जेंडर एक्सपर्ट. प्रोविंसेस में भी गए होंगे. कुछ तस्वीरें मैंने भी देखी. आज सुबह मैंने फोन किया इस सेशन के लिए. आई जस्ट वांटेड टू नो फ्रॉम द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एजुकेशन वेदर दे हैव बीन अ पार्ट ऑफ दिस कन्वर्सेशन और नॉट, और वेदर they have been through this document or not. What I found out was that yes, they have been part of high level meetings, because I could actually, when I was looking at the document, I could also see the secretary of education sitting in one of the pictures. But nobody has read the document. Nobody knows what's in it. उनको नहीं पता कि इसके अंदर एजुकेशन का पार्ट जो है वो क्या है और क्यों है. और इस फ्रेम को वर्क को जैसे डॉक्टर बारी ने अपनी थॉट जब फिनिश की कि इसको हमने ऑपरेशनलाइज कैसे करना है. सो एक तो वो चीज कि कंसल्टेटिव होगा किसी हद तक, जिस तरह से हमारे और बाकी सारी चीजें होती हैं, लेकिन आई थिंक बहुत क्लैरिटी की जरूरत है कि हु इज दिस डॉक्यूमेंट फॉर, कंसिडरिंग ये फेडरल लेवल पे प्लानिंग कमीशन का डॉक्यूमेंट है, एंड विमेन एम्पावरमेंट, ये डेवलपमेंट, एजुकेशन, एवरीथिंग ऑफ दैट नेचर इज अ प्रोविंशियल सब्जेक्ट. सो ये कि ये किसका डॉक्यूमेंट है, ये किसको गाइड करेगा, किस तरह गाइड करेगा, बिकॉज दे डोंट अंडरस्टैंड दिस डॉक्यूमेंट बाय द वे. और फिर ये कि प्रोविंसेस के साथ आप कैसे सिक्योर करेंगे एनी फॉर्म ऑफ अग्रीमेंट टू मेक श्योर दैट दिस इज अडॉप्टेड, क्योंकि उनकी अपनी अपनी पॉलिसीज हैं, अपने अपने फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं, अपने सेक्टर प्लान्स हैं, अपनी पॉलिसीज हैं. ऑलरेडी अगले 5 सालों का वर्कआउट किया है उन्होंने. तो आपने ऐसी क्या मोडालिटी कोऑर्डिनेशन की अग्रीमेंट लेने के लिए अडॉप्ट की है, जैसे हमने करिकुलम के वक्त देखा कि एसएनसी की डिबेट में कि आपने वो अग्रीमेंट तो लिया ही नहीं, तो कैसे आप सोच रहे हैं कि आप इसको आगे लेकर जाएंगे. 2-3 और मेरी थॉट्स हैं, बट आई थिंक आई लेट अदर पीपल जंप इन, बी अ पार्ट ऑफ द कॉन्वर्सेशन, एंड इफ आई हैव इनफ टाइम लेफ्ट एट द एंड आई कैन कंट्रीब्यूट मोर.
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Razak. I think actually it's also a reasonably good segue. Dr. Nasima Zainul Abidin, Aisha mentioned, this idea. I mean, she touched on it very briefly. The issue of access, and of course, the issue isn't just physical access. There's also many other constraints to girls' education. I don't think that people who aren't experts really understand the full spectrum of constraints. Issue सिर्फ distance of school या public transportation नहीं है. जब हमने इस पे काम करना शुरू किया, one of the things we learned early on in the Alif Elan campaign was on running water and sanitation. If you don't have it, then as soon as girls hit grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, it's impossible for them to go to a school at any distance from home without any kind of facilities that are required. So small things like that. How does the wider ecosystem prevent education for girls, Dr. Nasima Zainul Abidin? And do you think that the document in any way addresses that? Because mujhe document mein I saw a lot of the kind of complaining we used to do at Alif Elan. Things are really bad, things are terrible, things are really bad, girls aren't going to school, repeatedly. But I'm not sure that I saw enough in the document that indicated what the government actually plans to do about it. Dr. Saiba?
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Yes, I agree with you that the document, although highlights some of the issues, but it does not recognize the gravity of the issues. And the plans which they have for us on the paper are not very reflective of the diverse and very complex issues we have in the field. For example, as you mentioned, that access to schooling is an issue which has a very complex phenomena if you analyze it at micro level as well as in macro level. In micro level, if you analyze, there are various very important reasons behind this access being an issue for the girls, more issue for girls as compared to the boys. There are contexts mostly in the rural areas, the women and the girls who are more vulnerable because of their multiple identities. So before going into this issue, sir, if you allow me, I want to aid to Dr. Razak's point, where she said that this document does not, explain the concept of gender inclusively. So yes, that is very important, and it needs to be, inclusively explained in the document. Second to this is that gender is not a very simple phenomena; it's a very subtle, and this is one of the identities people have. For example, gender identity, one person have a gender identity, then the same person has an identity. For example, I am a woman, and then I am a mother, I am a teacher, so that's my another identity. Then the region I come from is my another identity. The language which I speak is my another identity, and the socio-economic background I come from, the cultural background I come from, that is my another identity. So all these identities intersect when we talk about gender equality or gender equity. So if we don't address these multiple identities a person or a girl or a boy or a gender transgender individual has, then it's very difficult to bring about this gender equity thing. So when we talk about the access of education for girls, then again these girls come from a very diverse economic background. Then their parents' socioeconomic background impacts their access, because if they are coming from a very poor family, so parents prefer to keep their daughters either at home instead of sending to school, so they may help their help them with their household chores, or engage them in some economic activities so that they earn some money and add to the household income. And similarly, if these girls are coming from a family where girls are not allowed to go out alone, so that it becomes a restriction for these girls that they cannot move alone, particularly if the school is in a distance. So these girls are not allowed to go to school because school is not in their locality. And then, as sir, you very rightly mentioned that basic facilities, basic necessities are very important for girls. The basic necessity is important for both girls and boys. But being in our sensitive in our societies, girls and then their particular needs after puberty, they have particular needs. So they need running water and clean washrooms. So if they are not available in any school, so these girls cannot go, or their parents don't allow them. And in studies reveal that in rural areas, mostly schools does not do not have these boundary walls. So parents are of the opinion that the schools are not safe for their girls, and there is not proper arrangement for parda and all those social issues for them. So there are various reasons that parents or the society restrict these girls to go to the school. So that is one point in access. And Ma'am Razak rightly said that access is a problem for girls. And then when some of the girls are enter into school, then they leave or they drop out after each stage of education. So they drop out more than boys in after doing their primary, and then after doing their elementary education, and then after secondary education. And then when it comes to the higher education, there is very few girls who reach there. And then these early marriages is one of the reasons, and then social other restrictions are other reasons for this dropping out. And then another reason is the quality. The schools which the curriculum which we provide to these young children, the learning and teaching and learning experiences these young girls and boys are exposed to, are also questionable. Research shows that in our private schools, particularly in rural areas, very little activity or learning processes are going on. So these girls and these young girls, they prefer to stay at home. They don't go to the school. So this is one of the reasons. And then if they stay in the school, again the quality research shows that they the girls and boys, they are getting very different education, and mostly the sexist gender norms, the traditional gender the norms and values which we have in our society are also perpetuating in the education system in the schools through curriculum which we provide to these young children, the textbooks we teach to them, the teaching and learning processes which we expose these young children. So these all reproduce and perpetuate the sexist gender roles. So and then after when they complete the education, the outcome of education is also varied for these girls and boys, because after completing their degrees, very few girls get opportunity to get a job in the job market, and then very few girls go into higher paid jobs, and very few girls get opportunity in management and leadership positions. So the outcome is also very different for girls and boys in terms of gender. So these are my humble suggestions, sir. So our
Well,
policy need to reflect all these issues of access in education, quality of education, as well as outcome of education. So all these very important dimensions of education needs to be addressed through the policy, gender policy, which will be we are talking about today.
yeah, Dr. Saba, that's I think a brilliant sort of summary. One thing that really strikes me from your commentary is I guess the notion of intersectionality, which really I think Dr. Fazana Bari, Dr. Razak, and yourself, Dr. Zainal Abidin, all three of you have kind of highlighted the importance of intersectionality, the fact that the issue of being a woman or being of any gender, male, female, or the third gender, that these identities are informed by multiple other factors, not just other identities, but also other socioeconomic constructs, political structures. That's with the electoral system, the reference that Dr. Bari made, and it seems to me, Dr. Amar Malik, that the ability of any kind of system to respond to the complexity on the question of rights and gender positivity at some level boils down to what we already know, and it feels often like we don't really know that much. To kind of be very crude about it, given that in a few moments I'm made to understand that the Prime Minister is going to address the nation. So to be very crude about it, I think we have this kind of habitual. One thing that a lot of feminists in Pakistan are accused of is, sort of a chest beating and kind of making noise without really, sort of. I mean, I think feminists know exactly what they want and what they're asking for, but the accusation does hold some water when the system that they're trying to operate in doesn't offer any robustness in terms of reference points. So maybe Ahmad, you can explain a little bit what your own experience is, because I know you've done some great research. Talk to us a little bit about that, but also how other places have begun to address the question of intersectionality in framing more gender positive public policy. Dr. Malik.
Yes, thank you, Musharraf, and thank you all for inviting me. I think this is a very interesting question. As a student of public policy, I had the opportunity as a young graduate of a public policy and PhD program to to give my input into the SDG process. I'm talking about 2015, 16, and my initial reaction was like, who cares what goes into the SDGs? Because in the UN at the time, they were debating small little things with the language, say this or that. And my point was, this is just bureaucrats going about doing what bureaucrats do, and this may not have real relevance to people on the ground in developing countries. But what I have come to see over the years, and I think this document is an extension of that, is that the SDGs, whether it's SDG 5 or the sub goals within it, it is providing a framework for governments around the world, both national governments and now increasingly sub-national governments, to actually do some sort of a self-diagnostic. And that is where your point about data comes in as well, Musharraf, when you said, what is the situation with data? So at least, if nothing else, this adherence to SDGs or going through a systematic process where in this document that we are seeing, there is a long list, especially if you look at the appendix, it goes from the objectives to some targets all the way down to KPIs, key performance indicators. So if nothing else, it provides a framework for the federal government to convene other actors within the government system to say, here are some of the priorities that we have. And then if you throw data onto these to measure some of these indicators, and I think the government wants to launch their own indicators now. If nothing else, it at least helps frame the conversation into the areas which we feel may make a big difference on women's livelihood. So the other benefit of course, data and the document I see talks about evidence-based policy making or evidence-informed gender mainstreaming, as it calls it. I think it is critically important to instill a discipline across the whole government system to collect better data, which is gender disaggregated, and also then to understand the context in which this gender data is being collected. I remember some years ago when I started working on public transport in Pakistan, I won't name this person, but I went to a senior bureaucrat responsible for managing major provinces' public transport system, and they said that we don't have a harassment problem in our public transport systems. And as evidence, they showed me the fact that there weren't many complaints about harassment or abuse or violence against women on the metro system. And my first reaction was, this is where your problem is. You know, we believe that our system is fair and that women who are facing these issues will complain, but in reality, they do not complain. And this is where the first starting point should be. So just to summarize what I just said, I think I understand, I sense some of the frustration in what Aisha Razak said, but I also feel in a country like Pakistan, where the discussion on gender is just quite fluffy sometimes in policy making, this kind of discipline, which forces people to think of gender indexes, measurement, self-diagnostic, and actually help break down what we mean by gender mainstreaming into little pieces. And then finally, if I can add, Musharraf, on this intersectionality thing, one thing I learned in reading about gender policy or gender-friendly policies in the literature around the world is that there are a lot of these gender-specific policies that you can introduce. Like this document talks about, like, for example, we can in a metro system, in a public transport, if the escalator is not working, that could be a very specific thing that you can do, or do other quotas for women to get jobs at certain things. But there are so many gender neutral development policies that have much greater benefits for women than they do for men. What I mean is, like, if there is greater economic growth and there's opportunities for jobs, women will also benefit from that. There's so much evidence on rural electrification in Africa, or water taps being connected with villages around the world, that when these kinds of general development policies happen, they are not gender specific or gender policies, but those general policies can also benefit women much more than they do men. So I think that we have to think holistically about these intersectionalities, and not everything needs to be gender specific when it comes to policy.
Dr. Malik, one sort of clarification that I want from you. I've always kind of been robustly very invested, frankly, in affirmative policy making. I find that the reaction to affirmative policy making, whatever the populist realities of politics might be, is really a power equation that is being disrupted. And so when that power dynamic is being disrupted, of course, there's going to be a reaction. So I'm thinking about the Michigan case with affirmative action and university admissions, and this goes back to the late 90s. And of course, I think we can track back a lot of U.S. populism to that case, and the way that people felt more confident about talking about race in the way that they were. And what you just suggested is that we don't always need to have affirmative policy, but maybe. Does it make sense to have at least some affirmative policy? Let me give you an example of what I'm thinking about. If you're going to have public sector employment parity or fairness, you need an aggressive multi-year program in which hiring women, especially in roles that are easier for women in terms of access, in terms of transportation, in terms of net likelihood of harassment, those kinds of things. So you need an aggressively affirmative action program that'll fix the numbers on the number of women that work, for example, in the federal government. Would you be against something like that, or is that aligned with what the wider sort of set of points that you just made?
No, that's a great point. I'm not against these kinds of measures. What I'm saying is that I was just making the point that this concept of intersectionality has to be understood more broadly. And I feel sometimes that in our enthusiasm for promoting gender specific interventions, that we forget that just general good public policies or generally better public services can actually improve women's lives much more. Like in the water example, traditionally women are responsible around the world for fetching water. So when that water pipe comes into your house, women will save a lot more time than men do because men weren't doing those responsibilities. So that's the sort of the broader point I'm making. But you're absolutely right, Musharraf. And I also feel there are legal reforms that need to happen in our country and other countries where, of course, you have to make right the wrongs of the past or the way that the systems are set up. So absolutely, there has to be a combination of these things, but let's not get totally obsessed with just one way of doing it. It has to be a whole suite of interventions.
So just picking up from that, Dr. Badi, I want to bring the conversation back to you. One of the aspects of the document that I found interesting, and I don't want to pick on the document too much. I think that in this environment, any kind of sort of positive policy making, it should be encouraged. So I think, whoever wrote this, Aisha's point about consultants, I mean, obviously consultants wrote it, right? But that's okay. I mean, that's a starting point, and hopefully, I know that Shabnam Sarfraz and others are very, very responsive, and so a lot of this feedback might be very beneficial. The question of federalism and this idea of the suite of policies that Amar was talking about, the question of intersectionality, which frankly, somebody like me who, supposedly is quite well versed in these issues, but I struggle to explain what it is. It's a half-hour conversation. It's a multi-paragraph explanation because these are complex issues. Given that these are complex issues and we have a complex federal system where we haven't really worked out how federal provincial relations work, how do you think the dynamic of getting a public document like this policy from the Planning Commission, how does that translate into action on the ground through the provinces? Do you see a path for that, or do you see it addressed in the document in any way? And what would be the way forward there?
Musharraf, this is not even a national policy, gender policy. Okay, it's a framework. Okay. जो फेडरल गवर्नमेंट ने एक फ्रेमवर्क दिया है, नाउ द फ्रेमवर्क हैज टू बी apparently when they launched it, that's what they are saying, that all the provinces are already on board. Apparently, they said that they have developed this framework in consultation with the provinces. Then once they launched it, that the provinces are on board. Now this is a framework, it's not even a national policy. What needs to be done after that? As we said, okay, I think it's a fairly comprehensive sort of framework. If Aisha says that, okay, maybe some consultant, but I must say that the consultant had then did a good job, to large extent. And I think I already flagged some of the important issues which I think needs to be also flagged, under each area, priority areas. But now what is important is when this document will go to in the federal government as well as in the provinces, then I think each sector has to have, use this framework in order to develop the sector specific policies that should be followed by their strategies, sector specific gender strategies, informed by the gender policy of that particular sector, then leading to that strategies, then lead to, how the strategy should be looking at, first of course, the nature of institution itself. What are the rules, regulations of the institution? How are we going to engender those institutions? How we can make institution as a more gender friendly places to work with? And I think there's a lot written in that document, that where they want childcare centers, separate toilets, transport, things like that, flexi hours, things like that. So I think from there, what is the institution, if they're really serious, in order to operationalize, there's some of these, kind of objectives which are mentioned in this framework. I think they need to see, how in terms of institutional kind of the capacity. So I think the gender capacity within the institution, and I totally agree with Dr. Aisha here, the capacity, especially gender, is seen as a very in a binary kind of a mod, there is a men and there are women, So intersectional approach is fairly new. And I think a lot of people don't understand what intersectionality means in terms of its complexities, in terms of its diversity and nuances, because although I must say that this document does refer to intersectionality, although it does not reflect so much into kind of a policy action, but Musharraf, since ye jo policy, ye framework hai, so I don't even expect them to go too much in details in terms of policy actions. Magar ye hai ki ये जो I mean provincial level पर आपको sector specific policies followed by their strategies, then to develop the institution के अंदर आपने the capacity build, the gender capacity needs to be built. And when gender capacity needs to be built, what does that mean? When you're doing planning, when you're doing programming, when you're doing auditing, when you're doing accountability, gender specific indicators, so all have to develop, you look into all that and then you develop that. So gender, kind of concerns are not left out. And I think what is said here, Dr. Amar जो बात कर रहे थे, देखो overall जो भी development होती है, everybody get benefited from, electricity अगर आ जाती है तो सभी benefit करते हैं, लेकिन that doesn't mean कि overall जो development है उसमें औरतें जो हैं, people, not only women, even the women from a particular class, यहाँ पे जब हम intersectionality की बात करते हैं तो or maybe the women can get benefit, but not the maybe women from the working class, maybe not women who belongs to the religious minorities in the same way, and women, who belongs to different, like, other kind of sexuality, the minority sort of groups. So I think the need, there are two things which I think is very important to talk about. Like यहाँ पे जो बात हुई, एक तो indices की बात है. मुझे ये लगता है कि ठीक है पाकिस्तान, I have serious issues with the kind of जो gender development के हवाले से women's empowerment की जो indices हैं. मुशर्रफ उसमें अगर आप देखें तो 3-4 areas को वो लेते हैं, and I think that's very Western oriented, and I think these indices does not truly reflect what is happening in terms of women's status in this country. Yes, we have like हमारा बहुत बुरा हाल है अगर हम overall देखें, but I think we have to also see the kind of data we collect within the country. It should also build, the data should also build on the narrative of change, क्योंकि बहुत कुछ पाकिस्तान में बदल भी रहा है. There are so many, there is a gap in gender literacy, for example, literacy rate में gap है, but on the other hand, there is no gap in the higher education, there's no gender gap in higher education. Similarly, if you look at women entering in bureaucracy, the civil service के अंदर, there are 400% increase है, अगले 15-20 साल में, whether you like it or not, you will see women bureaucrats sitting within the the government structures. और यहाँ पे फैमिली साइज कम हुआ है, कम हो रहा है, ओके इतना कम नहीं हुआ, बट स्टिल मैरिज एज बड़ी है. there are so many women who are entering into the labor market, formal sector में भी informal. आपका पूरा, आपका हेल्थ सिस्टम, आपका हेल्थ सेक्टर, आपका एजुकेशन और आपका एग्रीकल्चर, सब औरतें चला रही हैं. तो हमारा ये सारा जो नैरेटिव है जिसमें पाकिस्तान की औरतें जो कंट्रीब्यूट कर रही हैं, ये डेटा हमें कलेक्ट करना है. आई मीन हम उन इंडिसेस में फंसे रहते हैं, विच इज लाइक जो वर्ल्ड फोरम से आ गए या जो UN डेवलप करता है, which does not reflect our ground realities. I mean, I'm not saying कि हमारी वो मतलब हमारा gender gap चीजों में नहीं है, लेकिन there are women have agency in this country, and there's a lot changing in this country, and I think there is a high time. And what I like about this document is that they are talking about developing their own Pakistan specific gender this index, which I think is very important. It should reflect हमारी मल्टीपल, मतलब इतनी औरतें काम करती हैं भाई. आप गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर, पब्लिक सेक्टर में देखें, आप कहते हैं कि तो इतनी जो पाकिस्तानी औरतें जो है उनका कंट्रीब्यूशन है, उसको रिकग्नाइज हमें करने की जरूरत है. दिस इज अबाउट द काइंड ऑफ जेंडर इंडस्ट्रीज. लेकिन एक और चीज जो मैं बात करना चाहती हूँ, देखो एक सिस्टम के अंदर जो हमारे इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, जो हमारे स्टेट स्ट्रक्चर हैं, which are essentially still does not absorb this, they have not really given the status of women as a equal human being, no matter आई एम, जैसे अमार साहब ने कहा, आई फील दैट इवन लीगल रिफॉर्म्स की अभी जरूरत है, क्योंकि लीगली भी पाकिस्तान बहुत सारे ऐसे लेजिस्लेशंस हैं which still make women of this country as a second class citizen. Let's not talk about transgender and others. तो जो एक ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव फ्रेमवर्क्स है, पर देखो एक कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन तो इनहेरेंटली है ना, जो इंस्टीट्यूशंस जो हैं, जो फंडामेंटली पेट्रियार्कल हैं, जिनके रूल्स रेगुलेशंस, जो नॉर्म्स ऑफ इंस्टीट्यूशनल नॉर्म्स हैं, वो पेट्रियार्कल हैं. आप मेटर्निटी लीव्स नहीं देते हैं, आप सफिशिएंट ओके 6 महीना इज नो पेटर्निटी लीव, आप पेटर्निटी लीव्स नहीं लोगों को देते हैं, आप चाइल्ड केयर सेंटर्स नहीं बनाते हैं, आप फैसिलिटेट नहीं करते हैं. देयर आर मोर डॉक्टर्स, लाइक देयर आर मोर फीमेल डॉक्टर्स नाउ, फॉर एग्जांपल देयर आर मोर फीमेल डेंटिस्ट इन पाकिस्तान. लेकिन अगर आप अपनी पॉलिसीज को रीओरिएंट नहीं करोगे, तो औरतों को लोग वो वैसे भी सोशल, मतलब घरों में वैसे भी वो बिठाते हैं, लेकिन फिर आप स्टेट भी उनको फैसिलिटेट नहीं करती है. तो सो व्हाट आई एम सेइंग कि अगर हमने ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव, देखो जेंडर इक्वालिटी को जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, ये कोई सिर्फ टेक्निकल टूल नहीं है, इट्स अ पॉलिटिकल एजेंडा. तो अगर हमने उन इंस्टीट्यूशन के थ्रू इसका ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव पोटेंशियल हमने इंश्योर करना है, तो उसके अंदर हमें बहुत सीरियसली जो स्ट्रेटेजिक पॉइंट्स है ना, उनको डेंट करने की जरूरत है. और वो फिर हमें देखना है कि ये फ्रेमवर्क लेकर सूबों के अंदर जब हम जाएंगे, तो सूबे सेक्टर स्पेसिफिक पॉलिसीज जो है वो जब बनाएंगे, उसके अंदर फिर स्ट्रेटजीज, जेंडर स्ट्रेटजीज क्या होंगी, उनके अंदर फिर इन्वेस्टमेंट्स क्या होंगी.
I think that's beautifully, Dr. Bai, you've brought that together beautifully. And I'm just conscious of time, and I want to bring in Dr. Nasima back into the conversation, just to link this point about how we're going to get provinces to be more specific. One of the things that Dr. Badi mentioned that I find really fascinating is this kind of journey where there has been significant advancements in female agency in Pakistan, and even the conversation today is much more profoundly, I think, more progressive today than it was. Even though what that does is it exposes injustices and gender inequality even further.
Yes.
How does a policy framework, if you think it's possible at all, how can a policy framework deal with, even within one family, for example, hum baat kar rahe the ki, within sort of intersectionality and differentiation across class and those sorts of things, but even in one household, the degree of freedom and agency that women have are very different. The kind of almost deification of the girl child, and I think partly thanks to Malala Yousafzai, but partly just there's a massive cultural shift in how girls' education is at least talked about. We haven't got there in terms of the actual numbers, but then whether the girl child below the age of 10 or 11 is treated one way, and then the girl child between the ages of like 11, 12, 13, and maybe 22, a grown woman, is treated very differently. Old women are deified and have been traditionally for maybe centuries in this region. And then there's that big sort of gap in the middle, the kind of no man's land, where as a bahu or as a wife, there's there's a different treatment. This kind of life cycle that takes place in so many Pakistani households, South Asian households all over the world, really. How can a gender policy framework address this? And do you feel that this policy does in any way address this?
So it's very early to say that, because I was unable to analyze it at that level. However, when I went through this policy, I was quite optimistic. I was quite happy seeing that we have started to talk about gender issues at national level, at least. So there is a time that our gender issues are recognized and at national level, and then we start talking about it, and then we are now here talking about the transformation. So society's transformation. So your question is very interesting, and it's very deep question. However, I'll try to answer this. So I am I'm borrowing this concept from Madam Bari, Dr. Bari, that she said that these women are not a homogeneous group. When we talk about women in society or Pakistani women, so we need to recognize that these women are not a homogeneous group. As this was, very much clear from your question, sir, that in one household that women age, and then the position in the family, marital status, and then the age, it impacts a lot on the power which they get during this life course time. So this is very important, that the power, gender is a power play basically. So this the power which these young girls, which they get when they get married, for example, and come as a bahu, and then the power, the patriarchal power, basically in Pakistani society has, is with the mother-in-law. And then this bahu or daughter-in-law, when becomes a mother-in-law, then she gets this power. So similarly, the young child who is going to school is the most vulnerable, because she has no power, or she has less power, to make a decision about her life. So this is how this gender, issues, or this gender dynamic work in a society. So for me, for a policy, a country level policy addressing this important issue in each household, where in Pakistan we have so many households, and each household has their own unique culture, their own unique way of living, and then they have their own unique way of looking at these gender issues. So it's a very challenging issue. However, it's a possibility, because if we take it, if we take the gender discourse which we have in our society, if we look at this discourse, and if we try to shift this discourse within the country, so we may be able to do that. For that, there are various mediums to shift, or to at least push this, stereotypical gender discourses, the dominant gender discourses which we have in our society. So the one forum is the education. Education has a lot of power. If we train our teachers, if we train our textbooks developers, if we train our educational leadership, so if they are gender neutral or gender sensitive, if they want their students to be gender sensitive, so they can bring in a reflective kind of education, critical thinking, they can be engaged, students can be engaged in critical and reflective thinking, and then they can be mobilized for a better gender equal world, and then they can play a gender, they can play a better role in society. And at the same time, media can play a very huge role if we engage media in this, this discourse, reconceptualization of the gender discourses. And then the government at large can, train, as Madam Bari said, that the people who are making policy, who are implementing policy, they need to be educated first about the gender equity and gender equality issues. If they are taking gender as an alien subject for them, if they are not accepting this an issue, so they will not definitely they will not implement this with the right intention. So I believe that we need to have a ground level first to prepare for this policy implementation. For that, we need to shift this existing dominant gender discourse, which is more sexist or patriarchal, or more limited discourse. So my humble submission is this.
No, that's a really very powerful presentation, Dr. Naseema Zainal Abidin. We have unfortunately run out of time, but I would be remiss. Dr. Razak, I'm going to come to you last. Dr. Amar Malik, how do we, don't worry about the time. I really want to hear what you have to say. How do we what would you say to the Planning Commission? I really like the fact that you were as encouraging and encouraged by the fact that this even exists, and that it does, structurally deal with at least a number of key issues. What would you say to them, or how would you advise the Planning Commission on kind of next steps for the National Gender Policy Framework?
I'll keep it short, Musharraf. I think that what would be really helpful, remember that the Planning Commission controls a lot of the public sector development funds and programs. So they have a lot of convening power, agenda setting power. And I think if they can, translate some of the KPIs that they have identified in the last section of the report into or make some of their funding decisions contingent on progress that entities within the government system have made toward accomplishing those goals, I think that would set a very straight path and say, if you do this, or if you've shown progress made on this measure, then you will be given more funds. What I mean is that they have done a great job in identifying the different agencies who are responsible for delivering on different kinds of objectives or KPIs. It's just that they have to take it a step further and exercise whatever power they have within the current system of government to make it count, and use the data that they will be collecting in the gender index that they've mentioned as a baseline today, and then track the progress that different entities are making toward that in the future.
Ahmad, that was so pithy and concise that I was shocked, and it took me a while to recover from the shock and unmute. Dr. Asha Razak, as always, the last and final word to you. We had titled this session "Imagining a Dynamic Policy for Gender Mainstreaming in Pakistan," and obviously there's a number of issues a whole host of issues that we could have talked about. We were sad that we weren't joined today by Dr. Moiz Awan. You already mentioned, a number of the sort of limitations in the document. But what would you say excites you about potentially how this conversation might move forward? Here I'm doing my job in terms of forcing you to be encouraging and positive as we round out the conversation.
Look, the thing is, I'm going to start by saying that I agree with a little bit of what everyone said, but not entirely. और देखिए, मेरा issue जो सबसे ज़्यादा, I think उसकी वजह शायद positionality भी है. उसकी वजह शायद ये है कि हम जितने भी panelists हैं, हमारे अपने vantage point हैं, हमारे अपने experiences और backgrounds, और अभी भी हम जिन entities के साथ काम करें बहुत different है. तो वो मेरे ख्याल में थोड़ी सी जो मेरी pushback होती है वो उधर से भी आती है. सो मैं पिछले 10-15 साल से अब तो गवर्नमेंट्स के साथ काम कर रही हूँ, प्रोविंशियल भी और फेडरल के साथ भी. अब तो कुछ मैंने अरसा गुजार लिया है. तो देखिए, ये बात समझना कि ये हमने, देखिए मैं इसलिए एक्साइटेड नहीं फील कर रही कि हमने ये KPIs और ये चीजें ये सारी, क्योंकि ये हमने बड़े अरसे से की हुई हैं. इस लेवल पे हमने बड़े अरसे से की हुई हैं. हमने प्रोविंशियल लेवल पे भी ये बड़े अरसे से की हुई हैं. हमने प्रोविंशियल लेवल के ऊपर जेंडर यूनिट्स तक बना दी हैं. वो डिसफंक्शनल है, वो एक अलग बात है, लेकिन हमने अच्छे काम जो अपनी तरफ से थोड़े बहुत होते हैं वो करने शुरू कर दिए हैं. हमने PC1 के अंदर STG भी डाल दिया है कि आप ये बताएं कि जो ये आप PC1 जमा करवा रहे हैं प्रोविंशियली या फेडरल लेवल के ऊपर, प्लानिंग कमीशन का ही डॉक्यूमेंट है ना, तो वो उसमें बताएं किस STG के साथ आप ये लिंक कर रहे हैं और अपना रैशनल बताएं कि हम आपको क्यों फंड करें. एंड सो वो अच्छी बातें ऐसा नहीं है कि एग्जिस्ट नहीं करती. रिजल्ट्स बेस्ड फ्रेमवर्क्स भी एग्जिस्ट करते हैं हमारे पास, वो KPIs उस सूरत में जो so I think मैं इतने कंसाइजली, इतनी एलोक्वेंटली बात नहीं कर सकती जितनी अमार ने की है, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल में ये डॉक्यूमेंट ज्यादा यूजफुल होगा. अगर हो सकता था पहले भी टू बिगिन विद, लेकिन क्योंकि अब इतना नहीं है, तो इसको जो एक स्टेप आगे लेके जाने के लिए मेरे ख्याल में जो जरूरी है. और देखिए, काफी सारी ये जो मेरी बात है इज इन्फॉर्म्ड बाय माय ओन थिंकिंग अबाउट हाउ वो पॉलिसी एजुकेशन की अनफॉर्चुनेटली नहीं निकली इस गवर्नमेंट की फॉर वेरियस रीजंस, लेकिन जो एक थिंकिंग शुरू हो चुकी थी मिनिस्ट्री में, मुझे वो नजर आना शुरू हो गया है कि ये जो लिमिटेशंस हैं इन डॉक्यूमेंट्स की वो क्या हैं और क्यों हैं. सो मेरा अपना ये ख्याल है कि इस लेवल के ऊपर, फेडरल गवर्नमेंट के लेवल के ऊपर, ये बड़ा यूजफुल डॉक्यूमेंट होगा अगर इसकी नेक्स्ट आइटरेशन में, फॉर एग्जांपल, ये थोड़ा सा क्लीन कर ले डॉक्यूमेंट को. मुझे लगता है दिस डॉक्यूमेंट इज डूइंग अ लॉट ऑफ थिंग्स. दिस डॉक्यूमेंट इज नॉट अ फ्रेमवर्क पर से. फ्रेमवर्क आसान जबान में होता क्या है? थिंकिंग, क्लैरिटी लाने का आपका एक तरीका होता है कि आपने एक प्रोसेस में से गुजरना है. हाउ डू यू थिंक अबाउट इट? आई थिंक वो बहुत हेल्प नहीं कर रहा है. कुछ अच्छी चीजें हैं, जैसे वो गवर्नेंस के सेक्शन में उन्होंने आइडेंटिफाई की हैं कि डेटा कलेक्ट करें और जेंडर रिस्पॉन्सिव बजटिंग करें, दिस एंड दैट, वो अच्छी चीजें हैं. लेकिन वो पूरे तरीके से वो थिंकिंग जो है एक क्लियर, वो नहीं ये दे सका डॉक्यूमेंट. मेरे ख्याल में जो अब इनको बताना जरूरी है, वो ये बताना जरूरी है कि फेडरल लेवल के ऊपर जो मिनिस्ट्रीज इन्वॉल्व हैं इन 6 बड़े एरियाज के अंदर, वो इस डॉक्यूमेंट को कैसे अडॉप्ट करें, अपना कैसे बनाएं, और उसके लिए बड़े बड़े वो फ्रेमवर्क के अंदर स्टेप्स क्या हैं. उसके बाद प्रोविंसेस के साथ भी जाहिर है यही एक्सरसाइज होनी चाहिए. मुझे जो एक और चीज़ थोड़ी प्रॉब्लमेटिक लगती है वो ये लगती है कि हर, फॉर एग्जांपल एजुकेशन के अंदर हर प्रोविंस का अगले 5 साल का प्लान बन चुका है. तो फिर इसका क्या मतलब है कि अगर उन्होंने
how do we integrate? Yeah.
इंटीग्रेट आप कैसे करते हैं. सो मुशर्रफ, मुझे पता है यू रनिंग आउट ऑफ टाइम एंड मे बी गेटिंग अ लिटिल impatient because you want to understand what's happening on the political side of things. लेकिन आई थिंक ये बहुत जरूरी है स्टेप सारे करने. अच्छा, टू बिगिन विद मैं कहती हूँ एक सबसे आसान काम कर लें, फेडरल लेवल के ऊपर अपने PC1s के अंदर ये डाल ले आप क्लॉज के जब तक आप ये जेंडर डिसएग्रीगेटेड ये हमें बातें नहीं बताएंगे, डेटा नहीं बताएंगे, रिजल्ट्स जेंडर ब्रेकडाउन के साथ नहीं बताएंगे, हम आपको फंड नहीं करेंगे. बाय द वे 2 दिन पहले उन्होंने कह दिया है प्लानिंग कमीशन ने कि हम कोई 25-30% पैसे काट रहे हैं एजुकेशन वालों के. सो बड़े बड़े इश्यूज हैं अभी. ये बड़ी अच्छी बातें हैं लेकिन ये जरा थोड़ी सी टाइम निकाल के करने वाली बातें हैं. सो आई थिंक विल डू मे बी अनदर सेशन ऑन दिस एट सम अदर पॉइंट वेयर आई कैन maybe talk about the real education issues in this document.
Sure. I mean, there's so much that we haven't talked about, and one of the big issues that we've left out is really the financing kind of question
और
around.
मुशर्रफ, आई एम सॉरी, आखिरी बात देखिए, और वो मेरी, मैं इसलिए करना चाहती हूँ क्योंकि मेरी आपसे जब एजुकेशन पॉलिसी की थोड़ी सी बातें हो रही थी तो हमने ये बातें डिस्कस की थी. देखिए, बड़ा यूजफुल होगा ये अगर डॉक्यूमेंट ऐसे बनता या इसके साथ अपेंडेड डॉक्यूमेंट्स ऐसे बनते विच देन हेल्प जो बाकी एंटिटीज जिन्होंने ये काम करना है फॉर देम टू अंडरस्टैंड ये काम करना कैसे है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, जहाँ पे सिचुएशन एनालिसिस किया हुआ है, भाई आप थोड़ा सा वो लीगल फ्रेमवर्क्स का भी एनालिसिस कर दें कि वहां पे क्या चीजें लैकिंग है जिनको ठीक करना है, सो दैट यू कैन एक्चुअली डू दिस वर्क. पॉलिसी सिनेरियो में क्या है, इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क्स कैसे चेंज होने वाले हैं, ये चीजें अगर आप करके बता देते तो दूसरे के लिए करना ये आसान हो जाता. तो एटलीस्ट फेडरल लेवल पे तो आप कोई ऐसी चीज बना देते जो कि लेकर पीपल कैन जस्ट रन विद इट. मुझे ये लगा है वैसे जो एजुकेशन का कंपोनेंट भी देख के ऑनेस्टली मुझे ये लगा है कि इन्होंने किया क्या है कि बहुत सारे जो ऑलरेडी काम मिनिस्ट्रीज या नैफटेक कर रहे थे, इन्होंने उनको लिया है और इधर डाल दिया है ताकि वो ये लगे कि ये बड़ा अलाइंड फ्रेमवर्क है. क्योंकि देखिए कल को जब ये चीजें आपको होती हुई नजर आएंगी बिकॉज दे वर ऑलरेडी प्लान, तो लगेगा कि ये देखिए कितना अलाइंड है विद द फ्रेमवर्क दैट वी हैव प्रपोज्ड. मुझे ये लगता है कि ये एक्सरसाइज थोड़ी ऐसे की गई है. इसको थोड़ा बेहतर कर लें नेक्स्ट आइटरेशन में तो शायद फिर ये थोड़ा बेहतर हो जाएगा.
Well, hopefully this conversation, the one that we've just had, is going to help contribute to that. I'm so grateful, Dr. Naseema Zainal Abidin, Dr. Amar Malik, Dr. Aisha Razak, and Dr. Farzana Bari. I learned so much from you guys, and I hope, like Dr. Razak suggested, that under her leadership, we will reconvene again very soon and talk more specifically about the education aspects of this. And even that conversation needs to be broken up into multiple parts, including higher education, and the travails and challenges that female teachers face in this country, both in the low-cost private sector, in government schools, and in expensive elite schools. But that's for another day. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thanks to the fantastic panelists. We'll come back again real soon. Thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you for organizing. Allah Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you.